The parlour seemed to contract around them as Peter turned from the clock, his attention now directed toward the assembled household, with the air of a man selecting which thread to tug first. Graves produced a notebook with the resigned air of one who had learned that Whimsy's interrogations, whilst occasionally exhausting, tended to produce results that the methodical approach had somehow overlooked. They had gathered in the morning room at Peter's suggestion, a space that was marginally less suffused with the particular atmosphere of death that clung to the parlour like a persistent odour. There was Mrs. Ashford, a woman of perhaps 55, dressed in black with the precision of one who had anticipated her widow's weeds. There was young Mr. Richard Ashford, the nephew and heir apparent, a sullen man of 28, whose expression suggested that even grief was an imposition upon his time. There was Miss Catherine Ashford, the niece, dark-haired and quietly observant, with eyes that seemed to be cataloguing everything with rather more intelligence than her relatives displayed. And there were the servants, Mr. Hodgkins the butler, ancient as sin and twice as impenetrable, and Miss Ritter the housekeeper, a woman whose countenance bore the particular rigidity of one maintaining discipline through sheer force of will. Peter settled himself into a chair with the languorous grace of a man preparing for a lengthy social engagement. "Now then," he began, his tone suggesting that they were embarking upon a rather pleasant parlour game rather than an investigation into sudden death, "I confess myself in a state of profound ignorance regarding the events of yesterday afternoon, and I should be grateful if one of you might illuminate my considerable darkness. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps you might begin by describing the circumstances of your husband's death with such precision as you can muster. I am particularly interested in what your husband was doing in the hours preceding his discovery." Mrs. Ashford drew herself upright, with the air of one preparing to deliver testimony before an audience of considerable importance. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and colourless, the sort of voice that suggested decades of practice in saying nothing of consequence. "My husband was in the parlour from approximately 2 o'clock, she began, glancing toward Graves as though seeking permission to continue. He had taken his luncheon at 1, after which he customarily retired to attend to his correspondence and business matters. I did not disturb him, as he preferred solitude when conducting his affairs. At 4 o'clock I remember hearing the clock in the hall strike, and I recall thinking that I should soon have to attend to the arrangements for dinner. At 5:30, Hodgkins informed me that my husband had been taken ill." She paused, her hands folding with mechanical precision in her lap. "The doctor arrived within the hour and pronounced him dead. We assume it was his heart. He had suffered palpitations previously." Peter nodded with the air of a man absorbing information of some interest, though his eyes had already moved to Richard, who was exhibiting the particular restlessness of a young man forced into proximity with his own impatience. "And you, Mr. Ashford? Where did you pass the afternoon in question?" Richard shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I was out. Shooting. I took the shotgun from the gun-room at 1:30 and didn't return until nearly 6 o'clock. I was with Henderson, the gamekeeper. He'll confirm it." "Naturally he will," Peter remarked with mild amusement, as Mr. Henderson's employment depends upon your family's goodwill, and such circumstances do tend to promote a certain reliability in one's testimony. Miss Catherine, you were perhaps occupied in more domestic pursuits?" Catherine met his gaze directly, and Peter found himself registering with some interest that here was a person untroubled by the necessity of dissembling. "I was in my room reading until 4 o'clock, she said without hesitation. "After that I came downstairs and took tea in the small sitting-room. I had arranged with Mrs. Ritter that I should take my tea there, as the drawing-room was being aired. Mrs. Ritter can confirm that she brought it to me at 4:15. Peter turned his attention to the servants with the courteous smile of a man who had long since learned that the most reliable information in any household flowed from below stairs with considerably more honesty than it did from above. "Hodgkins, you have been with Mr. Ashford for how long precisely?" The butler's response was gravelly and measured, each word placed with the care of a man accustomed to weighing his words in matters of importance. 23 years, my lord. I entered service in this household in 1902. Remarkable fidelity." "And yesterday? When precisely did you last observe Mr. Ashford?" "At approximately 3 o'clock, my lord, when I attended to the fire in the parlour. Mr. Ashford was engaged with his correspondence. He seemed in his customary state, no agitation that I could observe. The sound of any disturbance, perhaps? Any indication of discomfort?" Hodgkins's expression remained unchanged, though Peter detected in the subtle tightening around the eyes that the question had touched upon something that required careful navigation. "I heard nothing untoward, my lord. The parlour is well insulated. Sound does not travel readily from that room." Peter's eyebrows elevated fractionally, a movement so minute that only Miss Catherine appeared to have registered it. "How extraordinarily convenient," he murmured, more to himself than to the room at large. He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, moving once more toward the mantelpiece where a small framed photograph had caught his attention. A younger Mr. Ashford, perhaps 30 years earlier, standing beside a woman whose features bore no resemblance whatsoever to the present Mrs. Ashford. "Tell me, Mrs. Ashford," he said without turning, "how long have you been married to your husband?" The silence that followed possessed a peculiar quality, as though the room itself had drawn in a preparatory breath before some revelation. Mrs. Ashford's hands tightened in her lap until the knuckles whitened. 18 years, she said quietly, and Peter smiled. Peter's smile lingered for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable, and in that elongated silence, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. A subtle recalibration, as though a weight had been distributed unevenly across a previously balanced scale. He turned from the photograph with deliberate languor, his expression betraying nothing beyond a mild aesthetic appreciation for the furnishings. 18 years, he repeated thoughtfully, as though confirming a particularly interesting entry in a ledger, a considerable span of time within which to develop a certain accommodation with one's circumstances. "And this previous Mrs. Ashford, I presume, is no longer with us?" Mrs. Ashford's composure, that carefully constructed edifice of widow's propriety, exhibited the faintest tremor. "She died in 1907, she replied, her voice adopting the peculiar flatness of someone reciting facts rather than emotions. "A riding accident, very sudden." Peter nodded with the air of one receiving confirmation of an already established hypothesis. "How tragic. And why?" "Our marriage to Mr. Ashford occurred subsequently, I presume." Within a respectable interval, naturally. He had not phrased it as a question, yet Mrs. Ashford felt compelled to respond nonetheless. "We were married in 1909. My father and Mr. Ashford were business associates. The merest flicker of something, amusement perhaps, or recognition, crossed Peter's features. He settled back into his chair with the grace of a cat, assuming a favored position, his fingers steepled before him in an attitude of profound contemplation. "How remarkably efficient of your father to arrange matters so expeditiously. Miss Catherine, I do not recall your mother being mentioned in the family narratives. Are you perhaps a daughter of the first Mrs. Ashford?" Catherine's dark eyes remained steady, though a faint colour had risen to her cheeks. "I am," she confirmed. "My mother died when I was an infant. Mr. Ashford raised me as his own, and when he remarried, my stepmother has been kind enough to maintain my position in the household." The precision of her language was not lost upon Peter, who noted with interest the particular emphasis placed upon the word kind, a term that, in Catherine's inflection, carried the weight of considerable irony. Richard, meanwhile, had begun to manifest the symptoms of mounting irritation, his fingers drumming against the arm of his chair with increasing vehemence. "I don't see what any of this has to do with my uncle's death," he muttered, his tone suggesting that he viewed the entire proceedings as an unnecessary impediment to the business of inheriting his uncle's considerable fortune. Peter regarded him with the detached curiosity one might display toward an insect exhibiting particularly predictable patterns of behavior. "Does one not? How very interesting that you should find genealogy tedious, Mr. Ashford, when genealogy is, in essence, the study of how circumstances devolve upon the living. But perhaps you are correct. Let us instead concern ourselves with the matter of the clock." He rose once more and moved toward the window, his posture suggesting that he was engaged in examining the rain-dampened garden beyond, though his actual attention appeared focused upon the reflection of the room behind him in the glass. "Inspector Graves informs me that your uncle was discovered at 5:30, at which point the clock in the parlour was stopped at 4. A discrepancy, as I mentioned, of some 30 minutes. A span of time that in matters of mortality can prove remarkably consequential. Hodgkins, when you attended to the fire at 3 o'clock, was the clock functioning properly?" The butler hesitated, a pause so fractional that it would have escaped the notice of anyone less attentive than Peter Wimsey. "Yes, my lord. I remember observing it. It showed the correct time. And you did not re-enter the parlour subsequent to that visit?" "Not until the alarm was raised, my lord." Peter turned from the window, his expression betraying the satisfaction of one who has observed confirmation of a privately held theory. How singularly convenient for our purposes, as it suggests that the clock was stopped sometime between 3 o'clock and 5:30, a window of time during which the parlour was allegedly occupied by only one individual. Yet here is the curious aspect of the matter that troubles me, and I should be grateful for illumination upon this particular point. A man does not, generally speaking, pause in the midst of expiring to attend to the mechanism of timekeeping. It suggests, rather, that someone wished very deliberately for us to believe that Mr. Ashford's death occurred at precisely 4 o'clock, a time, I might observe, at which several members of this household possess the convenient fiction of alibi. Mrs. Ashford's face had assumed a greyish pallor that suggested an internal struggle of considerable magnitude. Richard's restlessness had hardened into something more closely resembling panic, whilst Catherine remained observant, her expression suggesting that she was witnessing the unfoldment of something she had long anticipated. It was Hodgkins, however, whose reaction proved most illuminating, a subtle straightening of the shoulders, a fractional nod, as though Peter had articulated a conclusion that the old servant had been carrying alone for some considerable time. "I should like," Peter continued, his tone adopting the softness of someone broaching a matter of profound delicacy, "to examine the ledger that was discovered upon Mr. Ashford's desk. Inspector Graves, I trust you have preserved it." Graves withdrew a leather-bound volume from his case, with the reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. Peter accepted it and opened it to the final entry, his eyes scanning the handwriting with the precision of one trained in the detection of forgery and deception. What he found there appeared to delight him considerably. He looked up from the page with an expression of almost beatific satisfaction. "Mrs. Ashford," he said quietly, "I believe we must now discuss your husband's previous will, and the rather remarkable circumstances surrounding its recent modification." The afternoon light had taken on that peculiar quality of late October, wherein shadows seem to possess greater substance than the objects that cast them, and it was in this diminished illumination that the tension in the morning room achieved its apogee. Mrs. Ashford's hands, which had maintained their rigid composure throughout the earlier questioning, had begun to tremble with a violence that no amount of will could entirely suppress. She rose from her chair with the abruptness of a woman has suddenly found remaining seated to be an intolerable burden, and moved toward the window with the jerky, purposeful movements of a marionette operated by an inexperienced hand. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice containing an edge of something that might have been hysteria held in barely adequate check. "My husband's will is his own affair. If he chose to modify its terms, that was entirely his prerogative." Peter, observing her retreat with the clinical interest of a naturalist observing an animal under stress, closed the ledger with deliberate gentleness and set it upon the side table. His posture suggested that he was prepared to grant her the courtesy of her denial, whilst simultaneously indicating that he regarded, as the transparent fiction it undoubtedly was. Naturally, he agreed with polite concurrence. A man's testamentary arrangements are indeed his own concern, subject only to the limitations imposed by law and conscience, two restrictions that I confess I have observed to be remarkably elastic when matters of inheritance are at stake. However, what intrigues me is not the modification itself, but rather the timing of it, which strikes me as possessing a peculiar urgency. The ledger before us contains an entry dated yesterday at approximately 3:30, written in what I should characterize as a hand tremulous with emotion, recording a transfer of funds and a notation of considerable interest. He paused, allowing the weight of his observation to settle upon the room like a particularly oppressive fog. The notation reads, "If I am not mistaken, final adjustment, CH to receive full." And here the handwriting becomes illegible, though the remainder of the page appears to have been torn away quite deliberately. Now then, Mrs. Ashford, I should be fascinated to know what completion Mr. Ashford had in mind for that particular sentence. Richard had risen from his chair as well, his earlier irritation having transmuted into something considerably more volatile. "This is absurd," he declared, his voice carrying the querulous tone of one accustomed to having his pronouncements accepted without question. My uncle was a sick man. His heart was failing. He may well have been incoherent when he made these notes. I hardly see how my aunt can be held responsible for his mental state. Peter's attention shifted to the young man with the speed of a hawk spotting movement in tall grass. "Ah, yes, Mr. Ashford, your uncle's health. How convenient that you mention it, as I had rather been wondering whether anyone in this household had bothered to consult a medical practitioner regarding Mr. Cornelius Ashford's supposed cardiac difficulties. Inspector Graves, did you by any chance think to inquire whether the deceased had been under the care of a physician?" Graves, whose expression had gradually transformed from stolid indifference into something approaching keen interest, consulted his notes with renewed attention. "As a matter of fact, I did not," he admitted, the confession carrying the weight of a man acknowledging an oversight of some magnitude. "The family suggested it was a long-standing condition." "How remarkably incurious of you," Peter observed, though his tone suggested amusement rather than reproof. One would have thought that in the modern age, the confirmation of cause of death might warrant at least cursory consultation with those who attended the deceased during his lifetime. "I suspect, were one to make such inquiries, one would discover that Mr. Ashford had consulted no physician whatsoever in the preceding 5 years, and that his health was, in fact, remarkably robust for a man of his age. Am I correct, Mrs. Ashford?" Mrs. Ashford turned from the window, and in her face was written the particular despair of one who has been cornered by relentless logic and finds that the usual mechanisms of denial are no longer serviceable. He was well enough, she conceded, her voice barely audible. "That is, he had been, recently, in excellent health." "Precisely," Peter affirmed with the satisfaction of one confirming a mathematical equation, "which renders his sudden death at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon rather more mysterious than one might initially suppose, does it not? Particularly when one considers that the ledger indicates the modification of his will occurred immediately prior to his demise. One might even hypothesize, were one so inclined, that something in the composition of this new will proved so objectionable to Mr. Ashford that he was seized by an apoplectic fit upon completion thereof. Or, alternatively, and here I confess myself drawn toward this considerably more interesting hypothesis, one might wonder whether Mr. Ashford's death and the modification of his will are not two separate events that merely coincide in time, but rather linked with considerably more deliberate purpose. Catherine, who had maintained throughout this exchange an expression of quiet observation, now spoke for the first time since Peter had begun his interrogation in earnest. "You're suggesting," she said carefully, "that someone poisoned him and forged the ledger entry to establish a time of death that served their purposes." The statement hung in the air like a particularly challenging theorem, and Peter's smile widened with what appeared to be genuine delight at discovering an intelligence operative upon his own wavelength. "How very gratifying it is," he remarked to no one in particular, "to encounter a mind willing to follow logical progression to its inevitable conclusion. Miss Catherine, I find myself becoming increasingly persuaded that you possess depths, that your stepmother has perhaps underestimated." He turned his attention once more to Mrs. Ashford, whose face had now assumed the grey pallor of ash. "Shall we discuss, then, what CH stands for in that ledger entry, and what precisely your husband intended to remove from your inheritance before his untimely expiration?" The silence that followed Peter's question possessed a quality almost physical in its density, as though the very air had thickened into something requiring conscious effort to navigate. Mrs. Ashford's mouth opened and closed with the mechanical precision of a fish removed from its native element, her complexion achieving a degree of pallor that suggested an internal landscape of considerable turbulence. Richard, meanwhile, had begun to circle the room with the restless energy of a caged predator, his earlier pomposity having given way to something considerably more primitive. The panic of a man watching his carefully constructed assumptions collapse into rubble. It was Hodgkins who eventually broke the suffocating quiet, his ancient voice carrying the weight of accumulated years and witnessed secrets. "The initials stood for Catherine's inheritance, my lord," the butler said, with the dispassionate clarity of one unburdening himself of a load carried too long in solitude. Miss Catherine's mother, the first Mrs. Ashford, had left considerable holdings to her daughter in trust. The funds were to pass to Miss Catherine upon her 25th birthday, which occurs next month, or upon her marriage, whichever transpired first. Mr. Ashford held the trusteeship, and he had been maintaining the accounts with meticulous care for these 24 years. Peter turned to regard the butler with an expression of profound satisfaction. And yesterday, Mr. Ashford determined that he would alter this arrangement? I confess myself curious as to what precipitated such a dramatic reversal of long-standing intention. Hodgkins, you have been in service here considerably longer than has Mrs. Ashford. Did you observe any recent deterioration in the relations between Mr. Ashford and his second wife? The old servant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he responded, his words carried the careful precision of one navigating treacherous ground. There had been tensions, my lord. The master had begun to express certain doubts regarding expenditures that Mrs. Ashford had been authorizing. There were questions about repairs to the house, about improvements to the grounds, about certain jewelry purchases that had been made without consultation. Mr. Ashford had become increasingly suspicious that his wife's financial management did not align with their agreed arrangements. Catherine, whose observation of these revelations had maintained its quality of serene attentiveness, now intervened with a directness that suggested she had been awaiting precisely this moment. He discovered she had been embezzling, she said flatly. I overheard them arguing 3 weeks ago in his study. He told her he had engaged an accountant to conduct a full audit of the household expenditures. He said he would not tolerate theft, regardless of the marital relation. Mrs. Ashford made a sound, half gasp, half moan, and sank back into a chair as though her skeletal structure had suddenly lost the capacity to support her weight. It wasn't theft, she said, her voice barely audible. He had promised me security. He was a wealthy man, and I had given up my own fortune, my own prospects, to marry him and manage his household. If I took certain moneys for my own comfort, it was no more than my due. Peter regarded her with the detached interest of a man observing a particularly interesting species of self-deception. How convenient it must have been, he murmured, to convince yourself that systematic appropriation of funds might be characterized as recompense for spousal services rendered. Yet I confess myself wondering whether Mr. Ashford shared your interpretation of events, particularly when his discovery of these financial irregularities coincided, as it did, with his decision to alter his will in favor of his daughter. Tell me, Mrs. Ashford, had your husband threatened to divorce you, to expose your indiscretions to the authorities? The color drained entirely from Mrs. Ashford's face, leaving her appearing like a marble statue animated only by the mechanism of her breathing. Her silence was eloquent with confirmation. Richard, who had been processing these revelations with the dawning horror of a man watching his inheritance erode before his eyes, suddenly found his voice with considerable force. Uncle intended to leave his entire estate to Catherine, all of it, but the entail, the family holdings, they were meant to come to me. Peter turned to regard the young man with eyebrows elevated to their maximum altitude of skepticism. Were they indeed? How very interesting that you should harbor such certainty regarding the disposition of your uncle's property. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, was your employment situation adequately secure prior to your uncle's demise? The gamekeeper Henderson informed Inspector Graves that you had been rather pressing in your requests for an advance on your anticipated inheritance. He mentioned that you were in fact considerably in debt to several individuals in the county, individuals whose patience with your promissory notes had worn rather thin. Richard's face flushed a mottled red that suggested a collision between rage and mortification. That is entirely irrelevant, he sputtered. I am a gentleman of independent means. Are you? Peter inquired with mild interest. How very curious, as the local tradesmen appear to hold a rather different perspective on the matter. I suspect we shall discover, upon examination of your financial records, that you have been operating on the rather sanguine assumption that your uncle's death would resolve your pecuniary difficulties. A touching faith in mortality, Mr. Ashford, though perhaps not entirely warranted under the revised circumstances of your uncle's testamentary intentions. However, I digress. What fascinates me considerably more than the financial machinations of either Mrs. Ashford or yourself is the matter of how precisely your uncle's death was achieved. For achieved it was, I feel certain, not by the natural processes so hastily attributed to cardiac failure, but through considerably more deliberate intervention. He paused, allowing his gaze to traverse the room, settling finally upon Catherine. And I suspect, Miss Catherine, that you may possess information of considerable relevance to that particular question, as I observe that you have been watching this entire proceeding with the expression of one who anticipated precisely these revelations. What, I wonder, did you observe on the afternoon of your uncle's death? Catherine rose from her chair with a deliberation that suggested she had been awaiting this particular moment with the patience of one who understands that truth, when finally released, possesses an inevitability that cannot be resisted. She moved toward the mantelpiece, where the stopped clock continued its silent testimony to temporal manipulation, and her fingers traced its wooden casing with an expression of curious sadness. I did not observe the actual event, she began, her voice carrying the measured quality of one accustomed to speaking with precision. However, I observed its antecedents, which I believe are of considerable relevance. At approximately 3:00, having grown restless with my reading, I ventured downstairs to fetch a fresh volume from the library. As I passed the parlour door, I heard my uncle's voice raised in considerable agitation. He was speaking with someone, I could not initially determine whom, about betrayal and theft and the necessity of immediate action. The voice that responded was my stepmother's, though her words were too muffled for me to comprehend with clarity. Peter's expression suggested that he was absorbing this intelligence with considerable satisfaction, yet he made no immediate comment. Instead, he gestured for Catherine to continue, his posture indicating that the narrative was approaching something of material importance. I confess, Catherine continued, that I should have withdrawn at that juncture, recognizing the intimate nature of their discussion. However, my stepmother's desperation was evident even through the parlour door, and I found myself remaining, motivated by curiosity and by a concern that my uncle's health might be affected by such emotional turbulence. After perhaps 5 minutes, the voices ceased, and I heard footsteps, my stepmother's, I believe, retreating toward the kitchen quarters. I proceeded to the library and selected my volume. When I returned past the parlour some 15 minutes thereafter, the door was ajar, and I observed my uncle sitting at his desk, his posture suggesting profound distress. He was writing with considerable urgency, his hand trembling visibly. I did not enter, but I did observe him long enough to register that he appeared considerably more agitated than I had ever witnessed previously. Peter nodded slowly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in an attitude of profound contemplation. And did you, in the course of your observation, notice anything unusual about your uncle's appearance or his surroundings? Any indication, perhaps, that something had been administered to him? A glass of liquid, perhaps, or evidence of consumption? Catherine's dark eyes widened fractionally, and it was clear that Peter's question had struck upon something she had been wrestling with in private. There was a glass upon his desk, she said carefully. It appeared to contain whiskey, and it was positioned beside his left hand, his writing hand. I remember thinking it peculiar that he should be consuming spirits at that hour, as my uncle was not generally inclined toward alcohol before evening. Moreover, when I observed him subsequently, the glass appeared to be empty, though I cannot say with certainty whether this was because he had consumed its contents or because it had been removed. Graves, who had been maintaining a professional silence whilst absorbing the implications of these revelations, suddenly interjected with the urgency of one who has perceived the direction toward which Peter's questioning was oriented. "You believe poison, then? Something administered in the whiskey?" Peter rose from his chair with the languid grace that characterized his movements, and began to pace the perimeter of the room with the air of a man conducting a symphony whose movements only he could hear. "Poison is, I confess, a considerably more elegant hypothesis than the alternative," he observed. "However, before we embark upon the rather tedious business of toxicological analysis, I should like to direct attention toward a matter that has occupied my thoughts since I first examined that stopped clock. Hodgkins, when you discovered Mr. Ashford's body, did you notice whether the clock had been deliberately stopped, or whether it appeared to have ceased functioning naturally?" The butler's response was measured and deliberate. "The mechanism appeared intact, my lord. The key was in its usual location upon the mantelpiece. However, the pendulum was not in motion, and when I examined it subsequently, I observed that the hour hand had been manually repositioned to the 4 o'clock position, though the minute hand had not been adjusted correspondingly. It struck me as peculiar at the time, though I said nothing, given the circumstances of the master's death." Peter's smile widened into something approaching genuine delight. "How very astute of you, Hodgkins. And here, I believe, we encounter the mechanism of the deception in its purest form. The clock was stopped not at the moment of Mr. Ashford's death, but rather at some subsequent point, perhaps by Mrs. Ashford herself, though I confess I am increasingly disposed to suspect that she was not acting entirely alone in this matter." His gaze shifted to Richard, whose face had achieved a level of pallor that suggested an internal recognition of imminent catastrophe. Mr. Ashford," Peter continued with awful quietness, "I should like to know precisely what you were doing during the interval between 3 o'clock and 3:30 yesterday afternoon. Your companion, the gamekeeper Henderson, maintains that you were engaged in shooting together, yet I find myself possessed of considerable doubt regarding this assertion, particularly when one considers that Henderson's testimony would be considerably compromised should the truth regarding your uncle's demise emerge in a manner that implicated him in any fashion." Richard opened his mouth as though to protest, but something in Peter's expression appeared to freeze the words before they achieved articulation. The young man's hands had begun to shake with a violence that mirrored his aunt's earlier tremor, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of aristocratic assurance. "I was with my aunt," he said flatly. "She asked me to meet her in the conservatory at 3 o'clock. She said my UN. Clee had discovered her theft and intended to alter his will. She said that if we did not act immediately, everything would be lost." The confession, once articulated, appeared to have drained Richard of whatever residual dignity he had been maintaining. He collapsed back into his chair with the posture of a marionette whose strings had been suddenly severed, his earlier pomposity transmuted into the hollow shell of defeat. Mrs. Ashford, meanwhile, had begun to weep with a quality of sound that suggested not remorse but rather the keening of an animal recognizing its own entrapment. Peter, observing these demonstrations of psychological capitulation with the clinical interest of a naturalist noting the behavior of threatened fauna, continued his pacing with undiminished composure. "And what precisely did your aunt propose that you undertake?" he inquired, his tone suggesting a lecturer posing a particularly straightforward question to an exceptionally obtuse student. "She said she needed to speak with my uncle," Richard continued, his voice devoid of all inflection. "She said she would distract him, soften him perhaps, before making her confession. She wished for me to observe from the corridor, to act as a witness should things become contentious. I believed she merely wished for support, for family alliance in the face of his anger." Peter halted his pacing and turned to regard the young man with an expression that suggested the depth of his disillusionment regarding human capacity for self-delusion. "How remarkably naive of you," he observed. "Or alternatively, how remarkably convenient that you should discover, only after the fact, that your aunt's intentions diverged considerably from the innocent purposes you attributed to them. However, I suspect the truth occupies a somewhat more complicated territory. Mrs. Ashford required your assistance for a reason considerably more material than emotional support." "Hodgkins, When you attended to the fire in the parlor at 3 o'clock, did you notice whether the windows were closed or open?" The butler's response came immediately, as though he had been awaiting this particular question with the patience of accumulated years. "The east window was closed, my lord, though I observed that the latch appeared to have been recently disturbed. The paint around it was marked, as though someone had forced it open and subsequently closed it again." Peter nodded with the satisfaction of one confirming an architectural hypothesis. How very illuminating. "And the conservatory, which connects the eastern wing to the main house via the passage adjacent to the parlor, opens directly onto the grounds beyond those windows. One might imagine that an individual with sufficient knowledge of the household's arrangements could move from the conservatory into the parlor through that window without being observed by the servants who customarily occupy the main corridors. Is that not so?" Catherine, whose observations had maintained their quality of penetrating clarity throughout the proceedings, suddenly articulated the implication that Peter's questions were designed to elicit. "You're suggesting that Richard climbed through the window whilst my stepmother distracted my uncle from within the room," she said. "But that doesn't constitute murder. That constitutes assault, burglary, or at most manslaughter if something went wrong during a confrontation." Peter's smile widened into an expression that suggested profound appreciation for her logical acuity. "Precisely correct, Miss Catherine. Which is why I believe we must now concern ourselves with the question of precisely what Richard administered to his uncle during the interval in which his aunt's attentions were occupied elsewhere. Hodgkins, the glass that contained Mr. Ashford's whiskey, did you, in the course of your duties subsequent to the discovery of his body, examine its contents or remove it from the parlor?" Hodgkins's weathered countenance manifested a subtle alteration, a tightening around the eyes that suggested the butler was confronting a matter he had been deliberately avoiding throughout the investigation. "I did remove it, my lord," he admitted quietly. "I washed it and returned it to the sideboard. I believed at the time that I was preserving the household's dignity by removing evidence of the master's consumption of spirits. It was only subsequently, when I observed Mr. Ashford's body and reflected upon the circumstances of his death, that I recognized the significance of my actions." Peter moved closer to the butler, his expression suggesting both commiseration and a certain relentless pursuit of truth. "And what did you observe in that glass, Hodgkins, that prompted you to preserve it in such a manner rather than immediately reporting it to the authorities?" The old servant's voice, when it emerged, carried the weight of decades of loyalty suddenly confronted by the demands of justice. "There was a residue, my lord, a faint sweetish odor, and at the bottom of the glass a sediment that appeared inconsistent with whiskey alone. I have lived long enough to recognize the signs of substance not ordinarily encountered in ordinary beverages. When I considered Mr. Ashford's sudden demise, and the haste with which Mrs. Ashford had begun to dispose of items from his desk, I comprehended that I had likely participated, however inadvertently, in the concealment of evidence." Peter returned to his chair with the air of one who has finally achieved a satisfactory completion of a particularly complex puzzle. "And yet you did not come forward immediately," he observed, not with accusation but with a species of gentle inquiry. "Why, I wonder, did you choose to remain silent?" Hodgkins drew himself upright with the dignity of a man confronting his own complicity without flinching. "Because Miss Catherine is the rightful heir," he said simply, "and because, in my judgment, Mr. Ashford had been a decent master for 23 years, and his daughter deserved the inheritance that was her mother's legacy. I believed that in remaining silent, I was serving a greater justice than in delivering her stepmother to the gallows, however much the latter action might have satisfied the letter of the law." The confession hung in the air like a suspended question, and Peter regarded the old servant with an expression of profound complexity, something between admiration for loyalty and sorrow for the moral compromises that such loyalty had necessitated. "And now," Peter said quietly, "we must discuss the matter of precisely how much poison was required to achieve Mr. Ashford's death, and whether it was administered with intent to murder or merely to incapacitate." The distinction Peter had articulated appeared to traverse some previously unconsidered territory in the room's collective consciousness, and it was Mrs. Ashford who seized upon it with the desperation of a drowning woman grasping at driftwood. She raised her head, her tear-streaked countenance manifesting a sudden galvanization of purpose, and her voice emerged with a strident quality that suggested she perceived in Peter's question the possibility of mitigation. "I did not intend his death," she declared, her words tumbling forth with the urgency of one attempting to outrun the advance of culpability. "I swear, Oppo, my soul, that I administered only a mild sedative, something to calm his agitation, to render him more receptive to reason. I obtained it from my physician weeks ago, claiming that I suffered from insomnia. The dosage I provided was calculated to produce drowsiness and docility, nothing more." Peter's expression suggested neither belief nor disbelief, but rather the attentive focus of one cataloguing testimony for later analysis. "And yet your husband is deceased," he observed, with the precision of a logician stating an irrefutable fact. "A man does not generally expire from drowsiness, however profound. Therefore, either your estimation of the dosage was considerably in error, or there occurred some subsequent intervention that transformed a sedative into a fatal substance. Pray, continue with your narrative." Richard, observing the trajectory of his aunt's attempted mitigation, suddenly found his own voice with renewed urgency. "The poison was not hers," he blurted. "I brought something else. Something considerably stronger. I thought if Uncle was sedated, if he was sufficiently incapacitated, I could search his study for the revised will. I intended only to prevent the alteration of his inheritance, not to—" He broke off, his complexion achieving a shade of green that suggested the onset of physical distress. "I administered it in the whiskey whilst my aunt occupied his attention with her confessions. I thought it would render him unconscious for several hours, nothing more. How was I to know that the combination of the two substances would prove fatal?" Catherine, whose dark eyes had been following the trajectory of these confessions with the intensity of one observing a particularly intricate mechanism, suddenly articulated an observation that appeared to strike at the heart of the matter. "What substance did you use, Richard, and where did you obtain it?" The G-man's mouth opened and closed without achieving articulation, and it was Peter who supplied the answer with the certainty of one who had perceived the logical implications of the evidence. "Strychnine," he said quietly, "obtained, I suspect, from the pesticide stores in the gamekeeper's cottage. Henderson is known throughout the county for maintaining a small menagerie of hunting dogs, and strychnine is the substance of choice for protecting such animals from poisoning by vermin. One would simply need to convince Henderson that one required assistance in ridding the estate of a particularly troublesome fox, and access to such materials would be readily forthcoming." Richard's face had achieved a pallor so complete that it appeared he might lose consciousness at any moment. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I simply knew that something stronger than a sedative was required. The gamekeeper mentioned he had access to poisons, and when I asked for something that would render a man unconscious without permanent harm, he provided me with the substance. I was assured that a small quantity would produce only sleep." Peter rose from his chair and moved to the window once more, his posture suggesting that he was engaged in contemplation of matters considerably more complex than the meteorological conditions visible beyond the glass. "And yet," he said, his voice carrying the measured quality of one articulating conclusions that had achieved the status of incontrovertible fact, "we must concern ourselves with a matter of considerable importance. A small quantity of strychnine would indeed render a man unconscious, but only after a period of violent convulsion and considerable agitation. One does not administer such a substance expecting peaceful slumber. Therefore, I find myself compelled to inquire whether young Mr. Ashford's expectations regarding the effects of strychnine were genuinely as innocent as he currently suggests, or whether he harbored knowledge that the substance would produce effects considerably more terminal in nature." Richard made a sound of anguished denial, but Peter continued without acknowledging the interruption. "Moreover, I find myself wondering about the precise mechanics of the clock's cessation. A man does not, whilst undergoing the violent physiological disturbances occasioned by strychnine poisoning, pause to adjust the mechanism of timekeeping. Therefore, I am disposed to conclude that the clock was stopped subsequent to Mr. Ashford's death. perhaps by Mrs. Ashford in a desperate attempt to establish a timeline that might obscure the fact that her own sedative had contributed to the fatal outcome. And yet the clock was stopped at 4 o'clock, a time that postdates Mr. Ashford's actual expiration by at least 30 minutes. Why, I wonder, would one select such a time? Unless, of course, one wished to establish that the death occurred after the moment at which certain witnesses could confirm one's whereabouts. His gaze shifted to Graves with an expression suggesting that the inspector might profitably consider certain lines of inquiry. "Inspector, I believe you will discover, upon examination of the household's records, that Mrs. Ashford can produce witnesses to her presence in the drawing room at 4 o'clock, witnesses whom she has somehow neglected to mention during the course of this investigation. She anticipated, I suspect, that by establishing the moment of death as occurring precisely at 4, she could place herself beyond suspicion by virtue of alibis she had carefully constructed. What she failed to anticipate was that the clock itself would betray the temporal manipulation upon which her entire defense depended." Catherine, whose observations had maintained their penetratin clarity throughout this exposition, now articulated the final element of the deception with the precision of one who had comprehended its mechanisms with perfect clarity. "The real question," she said softly, "is whether Richard truly expected the strychnine to be non-fatal, or whether he and my stepmother conspired from the beginning to ensure my uncle's death, with each believing the other would bear sole responsibility for the crime." The statement achieved a quality of terrible silence, and in that silence, the full magnitude of the conspiracy, and the question of its true nature and intent, hung suspended like a blade above the proceedings. Peter's smile, when it emerged, possessed a quality of terrible comprehension, the expression of one who has perceived the final turn of a mechanism that had been operating with ruthless precision throughout the entire proceeding. He turned from the window with the deliberate movements of a man preparing to deliver a pronouncement of considerable consequence, and settled himself into his chair with the air of a conductor about to cue the final movement of a symphony. "You have articulated," he said to Catherine with evident appreciation, "the precise nature of the psychological mechanism that has permitted both Mrs. Ashford and her nephew to maintain, in their respective confessions, a certain residual claim to innocence born of deniability. Each believed that the other bore primary responsibility for the fatal outcome. Each convinced themselves that their own contribution was merely auxiliary, merely supplementary to what they imagined to be the other's ultimate intention. It is a remarkably elegant construction, from a certain perspective, the perfect crime for individuals whose primary concern is not with evading justice, but with evading personal accountability." He paused, allowing his observation to settle upon the room lick, sediment in still water, and then continued with the inexorable precision of one following a logical argument to its conclusion. "However, the truth, I suspect, is somewhat more complex and considerably more damning to at least one of the conspirators. Mrs. Ashford, I believe, harbored no genuine expectation that a sedative alone would suffice to preserve her interests. Her husband had discovered her embezzlement, had engaged an accountant to audit her financial management, and was preparing to alter his will in a manner that would render her essentially destitute. A sedative does not resolve such circumstances. Death, however, resolves them with remarkable efficiency. Therefore, I am disposed to conclude that Mrs. Ashford approached her nephew with full knowledge of what she was requesting, not merely assistance in obtaining access to Mr. Ashford, but assistance in ensuring his permanent removal from the complications of existence." Mrs. Ashford's denial emerged as a strangled cry, but Peter raised a hand with the authority of one accustomed to commanding silence, and continued with undiminished momentum. "You cultivated in Mr. Richard Ashford the conviction that his financial difficulties were attributable to his uncle's mismanagement or obstinacy. You encouraged him to believe that his uncle's death would resolve his pecuniary embarrassments through the mechanism of inheritance. You suggested to him that a temporary incapacitation might provide the opportunity to locate and destroy the revised will, thereby preserving the pre-existing testamentary arrangements that favored his interests. All of this was calculated, Mrs. Ashford, with the precision of a woman who had spent 18 years learning the mechanisms of her husband's mind and the weaknesses of her nephew's character." He turned now to Richard, and his expression underwent a subtle transformation, from condemnation to something approaching pity. As for you, Mr. Ashford, I confess myself disposed toward a degree of charitable interpretation regarding your culpability in this matter. You are, I suspect, a weak man, a man whose character has been systematically exploited by a considerably more intelligent and determined individual who recognized in your financial desperation the perfect instrument for achieving her purposes. You believed yourself to be acting in service of your own interests, when in fact you were merely the implement through which your aunt accomplished her own designs. It is a distinction that legal systems do not ordinarily recognize, but it is a distinction nonetheless. Peter rose from his chair once more and began to pace with the measured deliberation of one performing a complicated calculation aloud. However, there remains the matter of causation and legal responsibility. The strychnine was administered by your hand, Mr. Ashford. The sedative was administered by your hand, Mrs. Ashford. The combined effect of these substances produced a result that neither was arguably expecting, though here I confess myself disposed toward considerable skepticism regarding Mrs. Ashford's professions of surprise. Strychnine, when combined with certain sedative compounds, produces a paradoxical effect. Rather than producing unconsciousness, it intensifies the drug's action upon the central nervous system, inducing convulsions of extraordinary violence. A woman of education and with access to medical texts, which I suspect you possess, Mrs. Ashford, given your physician's casual dispensation of sedatives, would likely be aware of this interaction. Catherine had risen from her chair and moved to stand beside Peter, her dark eyes regarding her stepmother with an expression that suggested she was witnessing the final disintegration of a mask she had long ago learned. "Oh, see through." "The clock," Catherine said quietly, "was stopped by my stepmother after she realized what had occurred. She heard Uncle's convulsions, I believe. She heard him crying out in agony, and she understood that her plan, whatever its original specifications, had achieved a result considerably more definitive than she had anticipated." Peter inclined his head in acknowledgement of her observation. "Precisely. She stopped the clock in an attempt to create a timeline that might prove protective of her interests. She calculated that if death could be placed at 4 o'clock, she could produce witnesses, perhaps servants she had carefully positioned, or perhaps merely the testimony of her nephew, whom she had cultivated into a state of complicity, to demonstrate that she had been elsewhere at that precise moment. The tragedy, however, is that her attempt at manipulation became the very instrument of her exposure. A man dies of natural causes at 3:30, and the clock continues to mark the hours in its customary manner. But a clock deliberately stopped at 4 o'clock, hours after its owner's death, speaks volumes regarding consciousness of guilt. Graves, who had been maintaining the patient silence of one accumulating evidence for subsequent legal proceedings, now interjected with the practiced efficiency of a career policeman. "So we have deliberate poisoning by both parties, with intent to kill, meeting the requirements for a charge of murder." Peter's expression suggested the complexity of the question. "That is, I believe, a matter for the Crown's counsel to determine. What I have articulated is the mechanism of the crime and the culpability of the principals. Whether that rises to the level of murder, attempted murder, conspiracy or manslaughter, shall depend upon matters of legal interpretation and the specific legislation governing such circumstances. My role is merely to illuminate the truth. The application of justice to that truth is, mercifully, a burden borne by others." He turned to regard Mrs. Ashford and Richard with an expression that suggested a final judgment of considerable finality. "However, I believe we have achieved sufficient clarity regarding the mechanisms of this affair. Inspector, I believe you are now in possession of sufficient evidence to proceed with the formal charges you shall determine appropriate." The events that followed achieved the particular quality of anticlimactic resolution that typically characterizes the aftermath of revelation in cases of domestic crime. Mrs. Ashford, upon comprehending the full implications of Peter's exposition, underwent a psychological transformation that suggested the systematic collapse of whatever internal architecture she had constructed to maintain her equilibrium. She began to weep with a violence that seemed to originate from some profound interior rupture, her entire frame convulsing with sobs that appeared to extract something fundamental from her very being. Richard, meanwhile, had achieved a state of profound paralysis. His complexion had adopted the grey pallor of ash, and his eyes possessed the quality of a man who had suddenly perceived the chasm that had opened beneath his feet, and found himself incapable of generating any response adequate to the magnitude of the catastrophe. Graves, with the practiced efficiency of one accustomed to the mechanics of arrest and custody, proceeded to undertake the formalities of his office. He summoned the constables who had been maintained in the entry hall throughout the investigation and began to articulate the charges in the measured tones of official procedure. Mrs. Ashford offered no resistance to the placement of restraints, indeed seeming scarcely aware of her circumstances as she was led from the room. Richard, by contrast, exhibited a certain desperate resistance, not physical in nature, but psychological, his protestations achieving a quality of injured bewilderment that suggested he had not yet fully comprehended the transition from complicity to culpability. "I didn't mean to kill him," he cried repeatedly as he was conducted from the parlour. "I merely meant to. She said only that I should. I didn't comprehend that the substance would." His words faded into the distance as he was removed from the manor, leaving behind an atmosphere of curious emptiness wherein the machinery of justice had achieved what the mechanisms of morality had failed to accomplish. Peter remained in the parlour long after the principals had been removed, his posture suggesting that he was engaged in a final contemplation of the scene wherein the crime had been perpetrated. He moved toward the desk where Mr. Ashford's body had been discovered and examined the ledger with renewed attention, his fingers tracing the entries with the care of one reading a particularly intricate text. The handwriting evident in those final notations spoke volumes regarding the emotional state of the deceased, the tremor evident in his hand, the urgency of his composition, the sense of a man hastening to complete a task he feared he might not live to finish. The irony of his premonition, Peter reflected with a certain grim amusement, possessed a quality of classical inevitability. Mr. Ashford had anticipated betrayal from his wife. He had not anticipated that the betrayal would be collaborative, nor that it would arrive with such alacrity and such finality. Catherine entered the parlour quietly, her movements suggesting that she had been maintaining a respectful distance from the mechanics of arrest, and her presence appeared to warrant no commentary from Peter, who merely gestured toward a chair with the air of one welcoming company in solitude. "I should have said something earlier," she observed without preamble, her dark eyes fixed upon the stopped clock with an intensity that suggested it had assumed symbolic significance. "When I overheard their argument 3 weeks ago, when I began to perceive the mechanism of my stepmother's manipulation, I should have warned my uncle directly rather than maintaining a discreet silence." Peter's response emerged with a gentleness that suggested he perceived in her self-recrimination a particularly unjust allocation of guilt. "You are attributing to yourself a degree of omniscience that would be remarkable in any individual," he said quietly. "You suspected wrongdoing, certainly. You recognized manipulation and conspiracy, undoubtedly. But you could not have predicted with certainty that the combination of sedative and strychnine would produce fatal results, nor could you have anticipated the precise timeline of events that led to your uncle's death. The burden of responsibility rests upon those who acted, not upon those who failed to prevent actions they could not have fully comprehended." He paused and then added with a species of gentle inquiry, "And yet I suspect your uncle comprehended, at the end, the nature of the conspiracy that had claimed him. His final notation in that ledger suggests that he had begun to perceive the mechanism of manipulation. One might even hypothesize that his accelerated alteration of the will was born of a dawning comprehension that time was not an unlimited commodity available to him." Catherine rose from her chair and moved to stand beside the desk, her gaze fixed upon the entries that constituted her uncle's final testament to his realization of betrayal. "What will become of the estate?" she asked, and Peter perceived in her question not the avaricious inquiry of one contemplating inheritance, but rather a practical concern regarding the disposition of matters. That is, I suspect, a question for the legal profession. Peter replied. "However, I am disposed to believe that the courts will ultimately determine that the revised will, the one in which you were designated as the primary beneficiary, represents your uncle's final and authentic intention. The fact that it was signed under duress and in the shadow of conspiracy does not necessarily render it invalid, provided that the content reflected his genuine wishes regarding the disposition of his estate. Your uncle, I believe, desired that you should inherit that which was rightfully yours by virtue of your mother's legacy. The circumstances through which that inheritance is achieved are tragic, but the destination appears consistent with his ultimate intention. Graves entered the parlor, his expression suggesting that the formalities of arrest and custody had been attended to with appropriate efficiency. The local physician has agreed to conduct the autopsy, he reported. We should have confirmation of the poisoning within the week. The substances involved will be straightforward to identify, given the specific nature of the compounds we're investigating. Peter inclined his head in acknowledgement. I suspect your investigation will prove thorough and conclusive, he said. However, I confess myself now substantially fatigued by the mechanics of this particular affair. The fundamental mystery has been resolved, the principles identified, and the mechanisms of justice set in motion. I find myself increasingly disposed toward the comforts of London and the attentions of my club. He turned to regard Catherine with an expression that suggested a final benediction. Miss Catherine, I believe you will find that your future, though it arrives attended by tragedy, is considerably brighter than it might have been. Had your stepmother's conspiracy achieved its intended outcome, your uncle, in his final act, ensured that his daughter would inherit not merely property, but the knowledge that her father perceived her worth and acted, ultimately, to protect it. Catherine extended her hand, and Peter accepted it with the courtesy of one accustomed to the rituals of formal farewell. As he departed from the manor, the rain had begun to fall once more, and the Sussex countryside had resumed its customary appearance of respectable domesticity, betraying nothing of the darkness that dwelt beneath its surface. The motor car that conveyed Peter back toward London possessed a quality of merciful silence that permitted him to engage in the particular variety of internal contemplation that typically followed the resolution of a criminal mystery. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the windscreen, and the countryside through which they traveled exhibited that peculiar autumnal melancholy that seemed to pervade the English landscape in the approach toward winter. Peter's mind, however, was not occupied with meteorological observations or aesthetic appreciation of the terrain, but rather with the curious architecture of human motivation that had culminated in the events at Ashford Manor. It was a puzzle that extended beyond the mere mechanisms of poisoning and temporal manipulation. It concerned itself with the deeper question of how individuals came to persuade themselves that their actions, however manifestly destructive, could be justified through the particular logic of self-interest and circumstance. Mrs. Ashford had convinced herself that her embezzlement constituted merely an equitable adjustment to her marital contract. Richard had persuaded himself that his uncle's death would represent a deliverance from financial embarrassment rather than a catastrophe born of his own sea. Complicity in conspiracy. Neither, Peter suspected, would ever fully comprehend the magnitude of their culpability or the manner in which their individual rationalizations had combined to create a mechanism of destruction that had consumed them both. 3 weeks later, seated in his study at Piccadilly, with a glass of genuinely excellent whiskey before him, Peter received a letter from Catherine that proved to contain certain particulars of interest regarding the aftermath of the investigation. The autopsy had confirmed the presence of both substances in Mr. Ashford's system, and the Crown's counsel had determined that both Mrs. Ashford and Richard would face charges of murder, a determination that Peter reflected with some satisfaction, his own conclusions regarding their culpability. The trial, Catherine wrote, was scheduled for the spring assizes, and she anticipated that the proceedings would achieve considerable notoriety within legal circles, given the unusual nature of the poisoning and the relationship between the conspirators. She had, she continued, taken possession of the manor and had begun to establish her own household management in accordance with principles of considerably greater integrity than those that had characterized her stepmother's tenure. The staff, she noted, had received their situations with relief upon comprehending that they would be retained, under her governance, and Hodgkins in particular had appeared to experience a certain diminishment of the moral burden that had evidently weighed upon him throughout the investigation. Peter found himself smiling at this intelligence, a smile that reflected both approval of Catherine's practical competence and a certain philosophical appreciation for the manner in which the machinery of justice, however imperfect its operation, occasionally managed to achieve outcomes that possessed a quality of genuine resolution rather than mere procedural closure. The matter might have remained in this state of satisfactory resolution had it not been for the arrival, some 6 weeks subsequent to his departure from Sussex, of a communication from Inspector Graves indicating that certain complications had emerged regarding the legal proceedings. Richard, it appeared, had achieved a degree of clarity regarding the precise mechanics of his aunt's manipulation, and had determined that he possessed information of material consequence to his own defense. He had intimated to his legal counsel that he was prepared to provide testimony that would demonstrate that Mrs. Ashford had exercised a degree of psychological coercion upon him, that she had systematically convinced him that his uncle intended to alter his will in a manner that would render him destitute, and that she had suggested to him that the administration of a mild sedative would merely provide the opportunity to locate and destroy such a revised will before it could be formally registered. Moreover, Richard claimed, Mrs. Ashford had possessed considerably more sophisticated knowledge regarding the effects of strychnine than she had revealed during the initial investigation, having apparently consulted medical texts regarding the interaction between various pharmacological compounds. The question thus presented was whether Richard's culpability should be reduced in light of evidence that he had been a willing, albeit manipulated instrument in his aunt's conspiracy, or whether the law should regard both principals as equally culpable regardless of the psychological mechanisms through which their complicity had been achieved. Peter found himself rather unexpectedly summoned to appear before the Crown's Counsel to provide expert testimony regarding the psychological dimensions of the conspiracy, a prospect that he regarded with considerable ambivalence. The law, he had long since recognized, possessed a profound discomfort with psychological nuance. It preferred clear categories, unambiguous culpability, and resolutions that achieved a quality of finality. Yet the Ashford case presented precisely the sort of psychological complexity that resisted such categorical treatment. He composed his testimony with considerable care, articulating the manner in which Mrs. Ashford had systematically constructed a framework of belief within which Richard could justify his actions to himself, how she had cultivated his desperation, manipulated his perceptions of his uncle's intentions, and provided him with the specific instrument through which his complicity could be achieved. Yet he was equally careful to note that such psychological manipulation did not constitute absence of agency. Richard had possessed the capacity to resist, to seek verification of his aunt's claims, to refuse participation in her schemes. That he had failed to exercise such capacity reflected weakness rather than innocence. The trial itself, which Peter attended in person, achieved precisely the theatrical quality that such proceedings typically exhibit when matters of inheritance and domestic conspiracy converge. Mrs. Ashford maintained throughout a posture of injured innocence, protesting that she had been driven to desperation by her husband's cruelty and financial betrayal. Richard, by contrast, had adopted a strategy of managed contrition, attempting to convince the jury that he had been fundamentally a victim of his aunt's machinations rather than a willing conspirator in premeditated murder. The jury, however, appeared unmoved by both performances. After deliberating for less than 2 hours, they returned with verdicts of guilty for both defendants, a determination that Peter reflected with some satisfaction. The capacity of ordinary individuals to perceive truth beneath the various facades of self-justification and psychological manipulation. Mrs. Ashford received a sentence of life imprisonment, whilst Richard, in recognition of his relative youth and the mitigating factor of his manipulation by a more sophisticated intelligence, received a sentence of 20 years. It was an outcome that satisfied neither the demands of absolute justice nor the requirements of perfect legal clarity. And yet it possessed a quality of rough appropriateness that seemed, to Peter's refined sensibilities, approximately commensurate with the actual culpability of the principals involved. As he departed from the Old Bailey in the spring sunshine of April, Peter found himself reflecting upon the curious manner in which even the most meticulously constructed crimes ultimately collapsed beneath the weight of their own internal contradictions. The stopped clock at Ashford Manor had indeed proven to be the most honest object in that room, speaking truth that all the elaborate deceptions of the conspirators could not ultimately obscure. Justice might be imperfect in its application, but truth, Peter had learned across decades of investigation, possessed an almost irresistible tendency toward ultimate emergence.